accidentally freed a hanged ghost. The woman who tells this story is already married, and has a little girl. So in 2019, you can save some money to buy a small house to move out. The house you bought is quite old, because I heard somewhere that it was the previous owner. The owner of this house has already settled in the US, so it has been abandoned for a long time. This house is quite suitable for your living conditions. It has up to 2 bedrooms and a rather small garden, so this house is quite cool. It's so cool that it feels cold in the middle of summer. When I entered this house to clean it, I discovered that there was a ceramic vase behind the kitchen, but it was very old. Suddenly, my sister's little girl said, "Mom, I'm so hungry." But I realized that there is never a chance that he will be hungry in the middle of the night. That's how I advise him, go to sleep tomorrow morning. I'll take you to eat though. But this girl refused. She continued to cry like that, and then she asked me to get meat buns from the cupboard for her to eat. At this point, I found it strange, because until now her child had never liked to eat meat dumplings. Many times Miss Tack had fed the child, but the child always spit it out. But because the baby kept crying and asking like that, she finally had to go to the kitchen to steam the cake, then bring it up to feed the baby. The baby ate the entire cake before going to sleep. The next day, I learned my lesson. I gave the baby a snack about 1 hour before bed, but at 1 a.m. the baby was still crying and complaining of hunger, so I had to continue steaming cakes for him to eat. But that time was very funny. In the morning, her child wouldn't eat anything. After he ate a little, he spit it out again. But then at 1 a.m. he kept asking for food. One time, I bought him a cake and put it in the cupboard. At that time, my husband was bathing the baby. Late at night, the baby woke up and asked for food. The baby just told her sister, "Mom, give me some beef cake to eat." At this point, she said she didn't have beefcake. "Mom bought liver cake for me." The little girl shook her head and said Mom bought beefcake. At this moment, I went to the cupboard to take out the cake to feed the baby, and I was very surprised. Because the cake in the cupboard is not a liver cake anymore, but is truly a beefcake. I also thought that the seller must have made a mistake, but I don't understand why her little sister knew. She turned around and asked her husband, "Did you open the cupboard to see if there was any cake?" Husband just said no. "I didn't even know you bought a cake." At this time, her husband turned around and saw that the baby kept asking for food, and that the baby's neck had a red mark, so he asked the baby, "Does it hurt?" The baby said it didn't hurt. I think the baby playing outside in the garden accidentally bumped into this and that, so it got the same marks. That afternoon, when this woman's husband came home from work, he saw this little girl running in from the garden, holding a rope in her hand, and she said, at that moment she froze, because that rope was exactly the same as the one in the vase that she had thrown away. The husband saw that and turned to ask her, "Which vase?" Then I said it was the vase in the kitchen. Before moving into this house, I saw this vase. It was so beautiful, but inside it had strings and some pieces of paper. I brought it. Throw it away. Speaking of which, her husband's face turned completely dark, so he quickly took this string and brought it to the garden to burn it. But from that day on, her family's nightmare really began. Head. The next day, I was taking a shower when I heard a woman talking outside. It sounded really loud, but I couldn't hear clearly what it was. I thought it must be my husband. Just go home and go with someone to the house. When I finished showering, I came out and didn't see anyone. My little girl was lying down watching TV, and my husband hadn't come home from work yet. At that time, I thought it. Laughter of a woman coming from outside. She was startled and quickly opened the door to look, but still only saw her child. Her baby is sitting and playing alone. That night, she asked her husband, "Dear, do you see anything strange in this house?" Then her husband said no. "What's the matter?" At this point, she shook her head and said, "If you don't see anything, then that's it. My husband just told me if you talk about that thing then yes." My husband just told me that he has seen it several times. Sometimes when he was half asleep, he saw a dark shadow at the foot of the bed, and other times he heard voices talking like how many times he had heard it. But her husband has no intention of telling her, because his husband knows that she does not believe in spiritual things. She and her husband also planned to go find the teacher. Come tomorrow. Her mother-in-law had just come to visit. Her husband had just welcomed her into the house. As soon as he entered the gate, he said, "Why does this house look so dark?" Asked the couple if they had found a teacher to worship. The house had been left for too long and no one lived in. If they wanted to move in, they had to worship first. Then her mother-in-law said that she knows a teacher. "I'll call the teacher tomorrow to perform the ceremony for." That night, she spread the mattress for mother and daughter to lie next to the couple's bed. At exactly 1 a.m., I heard this little girl's voice screaming, "Grandma! Grandma no! Don't kill my grandmother!" At that moment, her husband jumped up and turned on the light to see her mother-in-law hugging her neck, her mouth mumbling, her eyes staring at the ceiling. Then her husband rushed over to cry, "Mom, yeah. Mommy. What's wrong, Mom?" At that time, I was also quite scared. She ran over to massage her mother-in-law's feet, but at this point she didn't know what to do, so her husband stood up, took water from the altar, poured it out, and rubbed it on her face and neck. "Mom." At this time, her mother-in-law began to breathe rapidly and then her breathing became even again. She asked her mother, "What's wrong, Mom?" Then her mother-in-law replied, He strangled me, he strangled me." Only then did she remember her little girl's words, so she turned around and asked her, "Who did you say killed Grandma?" Then this little girl started crying and said, "That girl is in our house, Mom." Then her husband also panicked. Her husband turned around and asked, "Who are you? Which girl?" Then this little girl was crying. She answered, "The aunt who often eats with you late at night. She calls you to wake up and play with you." At this time, she and her husband were pale. The whole family did not dare to sleep, so they turned on the lights and sat until morning. The next morning, her mother-in-law called that teacher, but unfortunately, she kept calling. But this teacher didn't pick up the phone. At that time, her husband said, "Let's just take Mom home first, let's leave our baby at Mom's house for now." In that moment, I was home alone. Oh my God. She said she was scared, she didn't dare stay in the house, she just stood outside the gate waiting for her husband to come home. It wasn't until that afternoon that I was so lucky that I was able to contact the teacher, but because the teacher was far away, he couldn't come back in time, so the teacher made an appointment that he would come 2 days later. Within those 2 days, it's just a nightmare for her. That night, while I was taking a shower, I heard voices and laughter from outside. I was also very scared. I tried to take a shower as quickly as possible so that when I got out, I kept calling for my husband, but my husband didn't listen to answer. While wiping her body like that, she heard a squealing laugh from behind her. She was startled and turned around to see a woman swinging on the bathroom ceiling. Then she screamed really loudly and ran out, but she just ran a few steps before she fell to the ground, and when she fell like THA, a woman also laughed from inside the bathroom. At this time, her husband heard her voice and rushed out to help her. Only then did he finally ask her, "What's wrong with you?" "I can't answer right now." She just raised her hand and pointed and said it was house, bathroom. When her husband ran in, he didn't see anything. She calmed down and then told her husband about the incident where she saw a woman in the bathroom. So that night, she and her husband always went to bed, but the lights were on, and wherever they went together. At night, while sleeping, I felt a very heavy feeling in my chest. When I opened my eyes, I was shocked, because I saw a woman more accurate than the one I saw in the bathroom. Swinging on the ceiling, her legs were struggling, her eyes were rolling back, her tongue was sticking out very long. She tried to scream but she couldn't make any sound from her mouth. It feels like something is blocking my throat. I wanted to call my husband up to help me in that moment, but my whole body was stiff. I don't understand why that scary face kept getting closer and closer to her. Each eye socket and mouth corner seemed to have blood flowing out. At this moment, she tried her best to struggle and scream, until when she sat up, everything disappeared, as if she had just gone through a nightmare. Hugged her husband and cried. So she and her husband stayed up all night together. The next morning, after her husband went to work, she went to her friend's house to play. She didn't dare stay at home until her husband came home from work because he was too scared, so the couple decided to go outside to rent a temporary motel for one night. Until the next day the teacher came to help her family. The next day at noon, this teacher came, and as soon as he entered the house, he pointed into the room and said, "There is a hanged woman here." I just opened the bag and took out a bottle of water from inside, then I dumped the entire room. While the teacher was throwing her like that, her husband suddenly fell to his knees, his hands clutching his neck, as if someone had just squeezed him. His eyes widened. At this moment, she was so scared, she hugged her husband and cried. The teacher just came back and he said, "Stay away." Then the teacher took a bottle of water and put it in his mouth, then sprayed it directly on her husband's body. Then he knocked on the bell and recited some chanting sounds that she did not understand. The teacher walked around her husband, then her husband breathed out and stopped struggling. The teacher just spread out a few towels, placed a few stones on top of them and said, "I will hold the ceremony." At that time, I didn't understand anything. I just sat next to my husband and prayed. When the teacher finished the ceremony, he said, "The ghost in this house belongs to a woman who had a miscarriage because she discovered her husband was having an affair, so she committed suicide." There was so much resentment that she was still there in this house, but the previous husband was very evil. Instead of doing rituals to escape, they decided to hire a monk to cast a spell on this sister. This ghost was imprisoned in this very house, so as the resentment grew higher and higher, this soul was contained in that vase. This sister is the one who accidentally opened the seal on this sister's soul. Hearing this, I was no longer afraid, but I felt sorry for this woman. Because we are all women, this woman's fate is very miserable, The teacher said this ghost loves her baby very much, so he wants to eat and play with her. When my mother-in-law came into this house and demanded that I call the monk back to worship, it was the ghost of this woman. I hated her and threatened my mother-in-law, then the two wives. Her husband even took this little girl to her mother-in-law's house, so her ghost was very angry, that's why he threatened her like that. After the teacher helped and gave the charm, nothing happened to my sister's house anymore, only my sister's child often wandered. The end of the story. Everyone who listens to the story finds it interesting. Please give me 1 like and 1 subscriber. I hope everyone has fun listening to the story. See you in the next videos. Goodbye.